Cindy is the core of everything that we're about here. Her story is the central one. It's why we learn what we do, why we are HEPE, why we are transitional justice. My role here, I think, is to recognize, I want to say again so you hear this, you are the center of all of what we do. I am merely here to listen and to try to add in any way that can help you, people who've gone through what you've gone through, and tragically, people who cannot any longer speak because they didn't make it. I've been here for a week. I arrived in a historic time. I've had the chance to travel to talk to a lot of women who are victims of sexual violence. And I kept throwing away the talk I was doing to try to meet the needs of what people asked me to speak about. So I'm going to speak about two really tough issues, but I think we're kind of used to having courage for that. And then I want to end with some of the creativity I'm finding here. But before I start, I want to say sexual violence is in no way biological. There is nothing that is natural or genetic or inbred in the human condition. It is found with hierarchies in societies where there is inequality. And it is, as the panel said this morning, political, among other things. I'm going to talk a little bit about how people are taught to violate and to abuse. I'm also going to talk about the fact that these relationships of sexual violence, especially among children, how they relate to sexual and economic power, and how this is made invisible. It's not invisible because we forget or we just don't see it. It's actively constructed. Let me give you just a quick example. I've written a lot. I publish a lot. I have to. I've got, 7 books and 100 academic articles. Twice in my life have I been asked to remove material if I wanted to be published. I didn't, of course. It was a big fight. Guess what the only 2 times were? About formal, recognized, international, non-governmental organizations raping girls. Even those who are publishing, trying to stop this, don't want to talk about it. We know, as the panel said this morning, that sexual violence increases in numbers, in intensity, in pathology, in range of victims, in sheer trauma to a society during armed conflict. And I want you to hold in mind that military strategy, and I've worked in lots of countries, military strategy, the books you can pick up in virtually any country specify rape, especially of children, as a way to destroy a society. Hold this in mind. Rape is intended as a strategy to break the hearts and minds. That's what it does. It isn't a story of Cindy. It is or any of us that have gone through this. It is a story of what we carry through to the foundations of the very world in which we live and its ability to survive. We know that. I have been stunned at the sophistication of analysis in this country. I will talk at the end about the sheer levels of creativity I find here. I find that from Cindy to the panelists this morning, to the women I've spoken with in Popayan, on the telefono with Putumayo here, a tremendous understanding of why these situations are taking place. But there are violences that I want to talk about 2 levels. 1, those that are doubly hidden, and those that are carried into peace. Let me just tell you briefly about my data. I follow fragmentos. It's what I do. I find pieces and bits of hidden stories, of invisible power and abuses, and I follow them into patterns. And I follow those patterns from local flows to national flows to global flows. And I try to come up with what are the realities of why we end up with a situation such as we're in today. Basically, in the broadest picture, there isn't a country in the world, and there especially isn't a country in the world undergoing armed conflict that doesn't require telecommunication equipment, computers, energy, medicines, vehicles, just name it. You have to have hard currency for this, which means that as these things are flowing in from global sophisticated markets, in order to pay for them with hard currency, you have to have a huge outflow of raw resources, whatever the world needs, gems, minerals, children, add it up. It's just, so you have these massive global flows. My talk is going to be situated in this. But what I want you to hold in mind is that all these transfers of arms and media and military advisors carry ideas of who you can violate, how you can violate, when you can violate, and how you can make it invisible. Okay, so to go to the first part, the doubly hidden. As I said, Cindy is the central story. So I want to add some of the reverberations that carry out. How many sexual violences do girls in armed conflict face? I've done this for 35 years, half of which have been in war zones. Worked all over the world, from the rape camps of Bosnia to Southern Africa to the favelas of Brazil. And I follow fragments to come up with one. You would be stunned at the size of the global trafficking market in children. It is absolutely predicated on preying on children, primarily in systems of extreme vulnerability, armed conflict. I've been stunned at the number of disappearances you've had here. This is where some of them have gone. I want you to hold in mind that with these global flows I'm talking about, children are also following. They are being transferred out with minerals and gems, with all of these flows. Let me give you just a sense. 1 million children are trafficked into the United States every year for sexual slavery. That's just one country out of what, 235 in the world? They're coming from situations of vulnerability, such as Colombia. This is a massive global trade. Let me add on this, okay, I'm sorry, this is horrible, but it's real. Body parts. Done a lot of work following body parts. You're talking about massive amounts of what people will spend to buy medical kidneys and add it up. I have been finding out that the work that we all do is dangerous. But my work, I don't have as much danger in what I study as my friends that are studying the global trade in body parts. These are the journalists that are getting killed. It's a big deal. Guess where some of these parts are coming from? I'm sorry, it's horrible, but it's true. These, I'm talking about, the story, like I said, Cindy's the center, but these are reverberations that are also shaping the reality. The ones, that are doubly hidden. Violent porn industries. You have people coming in from all over the world, and I'll tell you a story in a minute, because in situations of vulnerability, where you've got lots of rural areas, they can come in with a camera and exploit. I've done a lot of work with cyber exploitation. I'd like to tell you it's horrible, but also very important. There are many, many, many sites where these kinds of films and pictures are uploaded. In an average site, you can find upwards of, an average single site, you can find upwards of 1 million uploads per site of the kind of things I'm talking about here. Extreme exploitation. Also, sexual tourism in war zones is a big deal. All this is doubly hidden. It circulates underground, but it powerfully circulates. I was stunned when I started dropping into the sites, the dark websites on the internet, to find how widely it was easy to find babies for sale, buy children as sexual slaves on a cruise you're going to take. These are parts of our daily life now. Before I go on with this, I want to say it's difficult, and this is tough, but it's difficult to imagine if you haven't seen it, the sheer devastating and pathological nature, the horror of the violences that these women, these girls are facing. I suggest that anybody who works with this and hasn't seen it, go to an emergency room when a young girl comes in after she's been sexually violated. It's hard to imagine the impact on all levels. The magnitude of how many are affected. These shape the realities of political violence in our world today. I have said to women when I was talking in Popayan that they can start a story on what happened to them personally, and oftentimes I can finish it. Not because I've ever been here, but because I can sit in Africa or somewhere in South Asia or wherever, and I've charted this, the flows of pornographic images that teach people sexual violence. This is taught. And I have an image I always carry with me, so a picture I took once of a young male soldier with a porn magazine in his back pocket. And this, Instagram and various easy technologies today make these practices global. These circulate. It extends well beyond combatants. I'll tell you one story. It's this very, very sad story, but I feel that one is important. I'm sorry for this, but it sticks in my mind. I was in a country, and it was facing a terrible war, and I got a call from some of the doctors who were utterly outraged. And a very, very young girl, war orphan, had been sexually violated, had fled to try to find a place of safety, but vulnerable refugee or dislocados, they say in Portuguese, camps, pornographers had come in, and the doctors had found the girl near death. She ultimately died after being mauled by a dog because she was forced to have sex with a German Shepherd, who then mauled her. That was part of what they were filming. The doctors were outraged. They tried to do everything they could possibly do to get the people responsible prosecuted, and they met closed doors everywhere. So the doctors, some of us went to the embassy. The person, or the people that were doing this were Europeans. Please remember, this is global. And we went to the embassy of the people who were responsible. They had already flown the people out in the middle of the night. They didn't prosecute them. There was no punishment. And a lot of us sat there, especially me, because I'm older now and I can really mouth off. Said, you're decent people at the embassy. Why would you do this? And ultimately what happens, and part of why these realities become so hidden, is there's nothing worse than raping a child. So if we want to really put down an enemy, that's what we say the enemy does. How then can we ever admit that we, whoever we are, do the same thing? It would make us monsters. So no matter how good people are, quote unquote, there's a tendency throughout the institutions of the world to turn a blind eye to any kind of sexual violence that is happening with their own communities, while raising outcry when it's done by the others. So these stories are silenced. Why? Okay, this is a critical point here. It's a very kind of tragic one. These are business practices for a lot of people, okay? These practices of violent pornography and trafficking and the cyber world, these transcend armed conflict and peace. And they are economic powerhouses. I've got a lot of data on this. I've published a lot of data if you're interested. You are talking about trillions of dollars circulating in the world a year. Now think of that. That's the kind of money that people are making off of the sexual exploitation of children, women, boys. The sad part, this is such a huge economic empire that corrupt officials leverage power through this. They maintain their place by access to tremendous flows of resources and money. Clean officials find it extremely difficult to challenge these systems because they're so profoundly embedded in the daily economic and political realities of the world in which we live. Official critiques, and this to me is very fascinating. Almost everywhere I've worked, everywhere I've worked in the world, they'll say, You know, this country is corrupt. We have to fix this. This country is corrupt. This country is corrupt. But we stop at the national level. This is a tremendous way of silencing the global realities that are fueling national realities. And I've never, ever been, and by the way, let me tell you something. When you look like me, like a 112-year-old grandmother, you can walk smuggling circles. I have walked globally smuggling circles. I hang out with smugglers, I hang out with police, I hang out with anybody. I talk to the people who are smuggled and I get away with it because I look so stupid and non-threatening. But I have never charted, and so I can actually chart the flows, like step by step. I've never charted any situation of national corruption that wasn't fueled by global forces of extraction and profiteering. Okay, let me just stop for a minute because I'm going to make a shift in topic here. I want to introduce a concept. I came up with the idea of radical contradictions, I don't know, a decade and a half ago. Radical contradictions are things that cannot exist and yet you can't get away from. They are the official who is literally dedicated to helping a community in war, and he is also raping a young child while he's doing it. And we turn blind eyes to radical contradictions because we don't know how to resolve them. So this is one of my favorite stories of my experience here. So like about 2005, 6, and 7, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. And I come up with this idea of global fractures. Global fractures are global processes whereby people think that they are gaining power by certain practices, when in fact they are fracturing their society in a way that if we don't fix this, the societies will collapse. Trafficking, profiteering, all of this. People may think these are horrible but yet necessary ways of providing. I mean, if you look at Albania coming out of the war situation, there's been a tremendous amount of trafficking. People have justified turning a blind eye because they say it leads to economic development that'll help everybody. Right? That's a global fracture. Okay, so I talked about following flows globally and what that means for us in our day-to-day life, in Cindy's life, in all our lives. Now I want to follow these flows as they go from armed conflict into daily life into peace. Trauma and violence are embedded in the everyday. I have been wildly impressed talking to the victims of sexual violence and armed conflict here. I threw away everything I was going to say about why people violate children, because you all know it. We've had elegant discussions of this. From the academics to Cindy to the people I talked to in Putumayo and Popayan. Power, control, inequality, breaking hearts and minds. Everyone I spoke with, and thanks to Pilar, I've spoken to quite a few people, virtually all talk about the traumatic impacts. And then they stop, and almost everyone says, we have got to stop violence in the domestic arena. We have got to stop violence in the homes. We have got to stop violence in the schools. We have got to stop violence in our educational systems. And we have got to stop the violence of our institutions not hearing us, not responding, not taking care of our needs. And so I always stop, and this is why I put this section in. I always stop and say to people, well, do you see a link between military and domestic violence? And this is what I get. And I thought, of course you do. That's what everybody's saying. We've been traumatized by war violence. Now we're being traumatized by this. But what they lack were words. And so I want to talk a little bit about providing some words to talk about this. One of the things in just thinking about why this is so hard to talk about, well, A, we can't talk about domestic violence. We can't talk about child sexual rape in the homes, in the schools, because it's us. And we would be the monsters. So it's tremendously silenced. But we also silence by definition. If a soldier in uniform, if somebody who's armed, a combatant in uniform, rapes someone on the front lines of the war, we call that a war crime, and in many countries call and prosecute it as terrorism. That soldier then is walking home and rapes his neighbor. What do we call that? That soldier then goes home and rapes his daughter or his son. What do we call that? Then we have a peace accord, and that soldier continues going on and raping. Well, what do we call that? Well, for the most part, we don't call any of them anything except for the first one, which is a war crime. But if that is a recognized war crime because it breaks the foundations of societies to function in a healthy way, why is the same act in a domestic arena still terrorism? Another issue on top of just the way in which these definitions flow is that these massive extra-legal economies I was talking about, pornography, profiteering, trafficking, all of this, these products are put back into a society, and they continue to shape societies. The pornography pervades. People are going to prostitutes. People are, there's a word I hate, and I loved somebody who was speaking about this today. I hate child prostitution. It doesn't exist. There is no such thing as child prostitution. By the global laws, it's trafficking and it's sexual slavery. It's really evil. But these processes, most people I've discovered are good. But you can take 30% of a population who is purveying abusive, violent pornography, who is abusing children, who think it's okay that they were in war and now they can go home and do the same thing to their families and their friends and their communities. This re-victimization continues. It is almost, there's a point I want to make here too. I can't tell you how many times people have come to me when I've been living in war zones saying, oh God, you know, the head of the UN, such and such a force was just here and they had a party and they brought in all the 12-year-olds and had sex with them. I can't tell you how many times people have come to me and said, can you help us? These peacekeepers are raping our daughters. I can't tell you how many times, police we know about, but INGOs coming in from overseas. I mean, one of the worst things I can remember, I found an orphanage for a group of children in Africa, war orphans, living on the streets, and they were so excited until they asked me where I had found a place for them. I told them the orphanage. It was a European orphanage, and a Western orphanage, and the children said, well, we can't go there because they rape you there. I mean, these stories are pervasive, but now you all know this, but it's the impunity I want to talk about. So the impunity also pervades society. So these levels of re-victimization. I want to stop here and say, okay, remember what I said. Sexual violence goes up in armed conflict. As you move into peace, these high levels remain. I've been discovering for 35 years in war zones that there's only so much violence a society can take before it becomes crippled. Crippled societies die. They do. Look at history. Look at the last 10,000 years of history. Societies don't always make it. A lot of this is pervasive violence. We have to treat this. We have to treat as it moves out. As I said, Cynthia's story is center, but the stories that move out globally and those that move into peace, if we don't treat these, we lose our viability as societies today. Okay, so I want to talk about solutions now. I've said that radical contradictions, that global fractures, global fault lines, weaken the very foundations of societies. And I won't say this now, but some of the work I've done showing that if you have trafficking, there's a huge amount of economic profiteering that goes on. Just imagine this. You have trillions of dollars circulating in the world in illegal economies through the sexual exploitation of people. This money has to be laundered. It's laundered through banks. Banks allow this because they are making, potentially in some of the big banks, hundreds of billions of dollars themselves through money laundering. These laundering go into, this dollar bill here is worth nothing if it's illegal. So I have to use it. I have to launder it into viable legal channels. Countries allow even the best will turn a blind eye, not knowing how to deal with these things. Because if you're laundering hundreds of trillions of pesos into building economic enterprises in your country, you are building your economic development on the backs of the sexual exploitation of children and women and boys. This is an incredible concept to think about. It's also why it's very invisible. So those contradictions certainly exist, but they're also zones of vulnerability for us. We can exploit the very vulnerability. Invisibility doesn't work when it becomes visible. Thank you for your stories. It's an answer. It's incredible. If we study this, so why am I bringing this up to HEPE, to situations of transitional justice? As we embed these practices into daily life, as we move towards peace, we are embedding the very injustices, inequalities, and pathologies that provoked armed conflict in the first place. If we leave them unaddressed, they will merely flare up again. HEPE has a mandate and a very limited time to do it. There's no way it can do it all. No way. No way that all of these processes that we've been talking about can do it all. But if we begin to recognize these pathologies of sexual violence are forged across boundaries, that they are carried into daily life, and that they will continue to harm, however invisible they are to our analyses, we can then begin to put in place measures, at least in the future, to begin recognizing that we have to develop means to address this, to stop this before it destroys us. We can put in place conversations. We can explore definitions. We can explore extending these dialogues into society so that we begin to have a conversation about how we actually can stop these global processes. Transitional justice is about making a choice as a society to solve and resolve issues. Transitional justice is a beautiful place for these conversations because it's not about just castigar, you know, the individual to build jails. It's about reconceptualizing. And I'm going to end by complimenting you all. I have been wanting to come to Columbia forever. I am delighted and thrilled to be here. I have been hearing recently about this tremendous creativity that is burgeoning in Columbia to solve these issues. It's true. I have never heard conversations as creative as the ones I've heard about reparations, about the meanings of violence, about what we need to care and consider in dealing with this, about the critical importance of dignity and respect in situations of justice and empowerment. A number of the women I had very lengthy conversations over several days in Popayan, thank you, Pilar, that in their day-to-day lives, these violences continue. And there's a sad thing, which then I'm gonna end up complimenting you again. The institutions meant to help people, institutions meant to be safe, our schools, our jobs, our security forces, at worst this is what they're telling me, at worst continue to abuse us, and at best, they no puede escuchar. They don't listen. I've heard this so many times, no puede escucharnos. They don't know who we are. They cannot help because they cannot hear us. But the answers to this, I find remarkable. Women who didn't have the opportunity to study culture theory in the universities are literally, and I'm quoting, saying to me, we have to start by creating new imaginations. I'm quoting. To create institutions and institutional practices of an entire social system that hear us. Un gran riqueza. Él dice que este es un gran riqueza para crecer esta imaginación. I was blown away. Another quote, to learn how to teach people how to learn and unlearn cultural beliefs. Another one of my favorite ones, we need liberty of the mind. Of course we need every single thing that you all been talking about, but there's recognition that we have the opportunity to create something truly new. And I was talking to several people this morning. In many war zones I work in, I find people saying, well, this is what we had. Okay, and this is what we need to re-get again. Okay, we need to rebuild this. But what I find here is, well, this is what we had, and I think we can fill up this glass, and I think we need to create new answers in new ways. And I honestly want you to listen to this for a second, because I'm very serious. I believe you're creating models that can transfer to other areas suffering these issues around the world. Models are desperately needed, and I think that you're way ahead of the game. One of the last things that people said is, if the institutions can't hear us, don't just give us your solutions. Give us your knowledge. Give us some resources, and we will create new institutions. And I would say to them, you know, in my experience, when you create new institutions, and this is part of what HEPE and the Transitional Justice Program and the peace process is trying to do, you create new institutions, you anger the old ones. And that's oftentimes when repression takes place. To finish, I have had the opportunity through 35 years to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end of war. And what I found is that it is this creativity. That is what it is. It is not the elite levels forging really formal stuff that is changing. That comes after this creativity. And the creativity is circulating through the artists, the musicians, the storytellers, the people with new ideas of transitional justice, the people who have the courage to speak up in new and creative ways, the people who have the courage to hear them. To just conclude, because there's so many people here that are in law, I have a friend who just finished a book. She's a lawyer and teaches in the law school at the University of Notre Dame. And she has just finished a book about art and law, saying law is elegant. Law is astounding. Of course, we have all these arenas of creativity that aren't surprising. We're lucky to have Doris. But we kind of expect you to create, because I don't think you're going to breathe without creating. But do we apply this same amazing creativity, what's possible with law and justice and transformation today? So I want to thank you all. This has been a tremendous learning experience for me, and I really love Columbia and the people here. Thank you.